All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. I am going to hand it over to Drew with no further ado to talk to us today about USGS and their ScienceBase. Thanks for joining us today, Drew.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me. I guess I should check. You guys all hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
Okay, great. So I guess I'll just kind of start with the kind of introduction both of myself and of the ScienceBase system. Sean had reached out to see if I'd be willing to just share a little bit about what we've been working on with records management and maybe data management in general, kind of data publication. And I guess kind of to be clear there, this was a little open-ended. So Sean, hopefully I can kind of stay on track with what will be useful for you guys, and we can leave the structure sort of flexible if there's something that would be more interesting or more helpful for me to cover. I'd be happy to kind of let the conversation go in the direction that people are most interested in. But I thought what I could do is just give kind of an overview of the ScienceBase system and what we've been working on pretty intensively in the last, maybe about 2 years at this point, in terms of trying to utilize ScienceBase to help the USGS meet our goals and kind of these new requirements around publishing data and kind of integrating data management and data publication and sharing needs. So my background is I kind of come from a GIS research background, working with Python and metadata quite a bit at a science center. So developing some tools for metadata, working with it quite a bit as a consumer and producer, writing records and trying to manage records for a whole center. So I did kind of have a background in metadata and just working with data. But currently, in the last maybe 2.5 years or so, I've been the team lead for ScienceBase. So ScienceBase, for folks who aren't familiar or haven't heard of the system, in short, is a data sharing platform. We're an integrated kind of data and metadata platform that allows users to post content on the web. It provides relatively granular permission control. So if you're working within a specific group or a research case, you can kind of control the permissions on your items, and then as appropriate, make the settings on those items public to where they're accessible by anyone. So we offer a web browser interface where users can go in, upload content, but then we also offer API connection, which just sort of generically allows the system to be used in some flexible and interesting ways. So ScienceBase is not a new platform. We've existed, or that system has existed for about 6 years or so now. But kind of in the current context where there is now an increasing focus on publishing data and looking at kind of a process or conventions and workflows for publishing and sharing resources formally and tying that back into integrated citation to correspond with manuscripts or linking into digital object identifier, some of those other pieces. We've spent a lot of time looking at how some of the core kind of basic functionality of ScienceBase can be used as an option to help us sort of do some of those new tasks associated with what for us are now requirements in the USGS to make the data associated with scholarly publications formally available as well, or publicly available. So kind of with that general overview, what I thought I would talk about today would be kind of just sort of describing what we've been working on with using ScienceBase to accomplish those goals. So the slide I have up here, let me actually close this so that doesn't cover my spell. Sean, can you guys confirm, I see the GoToMeeting screen on my right where the attendees and the chat is up. Is that blocking my screen, or can you guys see it?
We just see the PDF.
Okay. Well, that sounds great. So I'll just kind of, I don't know, I'm going to have to shrink this a bit so I can zoom in as needed. So what I wanted to just do is kind of walk through this PDF here. This might actually be something that some of the folks on the call have seen before. I'm not sure. I think that some of my team members had actually presented this or maybe an earlier version of this at ESIP. But I do think it's kind of a nice overview, and maybe just a point to dive in with kind of our efforts over the last couple of years. So specifically here, we've kind of had this goal of looking at, with new data access requirements in place, what does this look like for USGS authors? So that is, where can they publish and host their data sets? What does the process look like to do that, kind of following formal guidance, and then just logistically with writing metadata, uploading files, obtaining a digital object identifier, citation protocol, et cetera. So this has really been a fairly, a rapidly evolving kind of task and landscape over the last couple of years. But what we've done on the ScienceBase side is try to look at how kind of the underlying basic functionality of posting content, controlling access to that content as appropriate, and then some of the other stuff that we've done in the system, like metadata integration. So specifically, you can create a resource in ScienceBase, upload an XML metadata file, and a lot of the content within that metadata file can be scraped or kind of ingested off the XML and used to build out an item in the system. So you'll have your original metadata, but then you also have kind of a head start on creating an item in the ScienceBase catalog. So what we're looking at here, let me see if I can kind of zoom in a little bit here. Actually, try this. There we go. So what we've got here, let me bring up the actual image of a landing page in ScienceBase and just kind of walk through this. So what we're looking at here is a landing page for a formal USGS data release product. So this would be the case of an author, in most cases, having produced a manuscript, so a text-based manuscript with which there is associated data, either the findings that actually, the actual files that represent, say, model outputs or habitat modeling results, that type of thing, or even input tables, any number of different file types. But what the general protocol that we're following in the Bureau at this point is that the manuscript, so the text-based document, will have a digital object identifier and a prescribed citation. And the data associated with that manuscript will have a separate digital object identifier and be a resource in its own right, in that it will live at a URL, be citable, and a kind of a discrete resource, but then those two components, the manuscript and the data, should reference one another. And so what we're looking at here would be the data side of that equation. So we have a landing page in ScienceBase. We would have a citation for downstream users to cite this content. That citation format right now is prescribed by USGS kind of policy convention. So we've been we work with authors in our system to try to auto-generate some of this or make sure we have the right pieces, but then set that up according to how those citations should be formatted. Then on the page, we're seeing some of the pieces of the actual metadata record, where if the author had generated either ISO or FGDC CSDGM metadata, we would try to pull in some of those values to ease the process of building out this page. So we're kind of seeing the title, the abstract. We're able to pull some key contacts and keywords from that metadata record to build out this page. And then here we're actually looking at the attached files. So if you can see my cursor, I'm looking at attached files, this ONSR geology zipped up bundle, and then the XML metadata file. And so what we've also got here is the external resource. So in this case, it's the publication that cites back to this data set. So I think some of the real challenges that we're working on trying to find solutions for, but I think in general, kind of in the scientific data community, how do we elegantly link resources back to one another? So if we have data and manuscripts being managed somewhat separately, what can we do to facilitate connections to support robust citation, but then also kind of discovery and navigation across those resources? So I'd say this is an ongoing challenge with the best way to do this, and the way we intersect with it in the USGS is that we're one of several systems that may have a part in this whole equation, but at least for a lot of cases, in a lot of cases meaning And in the Bureau, we may have authors who publish an internal USGS document or publication, kind of a scientific investigation report, or they might publish in an external journal or some of these other cases. So the scenario is not always the same in every case, but in those cases where we have one DOI for the manuscript, which increasingly is the case, we will try to put that directly on the page of the data. So we'll have this resource that actually lives at its own URL. I guess that's clipped off in the screen grab here, but then it will actually point back out to the manuscript. And on this page, we provide kind of a navigable link to help users or downstream researchers kind of make that connection and find the parts. And so in building out this page, we're sort of trying to accomplish a couple things. One is just the desirable end goal for downstream data use, kind of in a generic sense. That would be, how do we make this content discoverable? How can we ensure that people can cite it properly and access it? And so to that end, we will issue a DOI specifically for the data set. And then within the ScienceBase system, we apply some permission controls on the item when it's officially published, when the author's finalized everything. We actually restrict future edits in most cases to help support a static citation. We've had a couple of other cases come up. We could talk more about, if people are interested, about what might a dynamic data set look like, or citation practices for that. And so we have seen some of those cases. We're looking at good options for that, sort of try to explore those on a case-by-case basis. But generally speaking, and particularly for those cases where there's a manuscript that references one particular data file or has findings that constitute kind of the results described in the paper, those data resources really aren't changing. And so to that end, we try to ensure that they remain static in the system with just permission and edit controls. And so kind of walking through here, here's the actual digital object identifier associated with this resource. So in the Bureau right now, all of our data sets are being minted under the 10.5066 domain, and then this is the unique identifier associated with this product. And then what we also do, and kind of maybe to touch back on Sean's, I guess, initial request with talking about records management in the Bureau, I think there's kind of a couple angles to that from how our system fits in. So we're looking at sort of making sure that we do a good job, the best job possible of cataloging these resources, establishing a convention and a workflow and a tagging system. So specifically identifying these resources as being of a type in ScienceBase, so that we track them and ensure that we're managing them kind of in a uniform manner to support querying and downstream reporting, et cetera. But what we're also doing is trying to lean on or integrate with the Bureau level policy as well. And so to that end, some of the quote unquote management of these comes from the review process that authors are required to go through as part of releasing data formally. So what that would mean is that when an author finalizes and releases a data set, they have a reviewer look at that content and look at its metadata to ensure that it makes sense, ensure that there aren't data errors, et cetera. So in our system, we don't actually do that. We're a relatively small team, so we just couldn't scale in terms of the hours needed to be everyone's reviewer. But authors are expected to go through that process, and then the way we ensure that that did in fact take place is with this second number on the page here, this IPDS. That's the Informational Product Delivery System, I think, or data system, that we track products in the Bureau. When they go through formal review and are disseminated, they should all go through this system. So our mechanism of kind of imposing some quality control and curation on this is to ensure that authors have done this process, and we collect that number from them as sort of our measure, saying, okay, they went through the right channels. And so just to kind of show the rest of the slide here, when this page is then up in public, we have some capabilities in our system to track requests for the item, so either programmatic requests or browser views, as well as downloads. So kind of moving forward, trying to track how often things are being used. And then this is an example of the actual associated publication. So in our universe, most of the time, and in fact, pretty sure all of the time when there is an associated text-based manuscript, that manuscript is usually in another system. So it might be the USGS publications warehouse, or it might be an external journal like Elsevier or something like that. But practically speaking, that manuscript will be in a separate system that we don't have control over. But what this is trying to illustrate here is that we try to account for making or establishing a connection off to that resource by acknowledging its existence and then sort of parking the DOI, which is a navigable link, off to the resource on our page. And so we've kind of got this whole process where authors, the whole workflow is authors would finalize an associated manuscript if there's one associated, review and finalize their data. We can control access as that process takes place so people aren't viewing this page. That includes some other features such as allowing reviewers to access content, things like that within the system. So we support trying to make that process a little easier for folks. Then we make sure that we always have one DOI for this top-level landing page. Some of the conventions and practices for what the best approach is for DOI issuance relative to one discrete resource. So we've got this data bundle here. In this case, it might just be one file or a small collection. In other cases, there might be quite a few separate granular files that authors or downstream workflows may have some interest in referring to or accessing individually. That might be another discussion point on the call here, but so specifically I'm trying to describe, we always make sure that we have one top-level identifier for the data publication unit as a package. Best practices and the way that we support granular file reference within this with other identifiers is kind of an evolving landscape where we have some authors who obtain multiple other DOIs for files within a collection, or in some cases we just issue the one DOI for the whole package, and authors or downstream users might refer to components within that just by file name, but just using one DOI. So that, hopefully that's not too far in the weeds. Maybe we can come back to that if anyone would like to. And then just to kind of round out here, for some file types, we offer some different features. So we can scrape or ingest off of metadata files. We also, with a standardized metadata file, we set up a way to send those records automatically out to other systems. So that's a little bit in the records management realm. In the USGS, we're required for public data releases to send metadata records from those resources to the USGS Science Data Catalog Metadata Clearinghouse. So we have a metadata harvest that we set up. Authors can label their records and opt for them to be sent, and we can do that automatically. On the page, and kind of generally another challenge here is looking at tracking work by author or by center or topic, that sort of thing. So to that end, we have a contact directory inside of ScienceBase that uses the broader USGS directory system. But then we're also looking at integrating with ORCIDs or ORCIDs, depending on how you say that, but looking at kind of conventions and new opportunities there. And then ultimately kind of trying to create more or less a page that might make sense to a visitor to our system for the first time, where the resources can just be acquired. So with that, maybe I'll pause. We're about halfway through, and Sean, is there anything that would be good to try to cover at this point, or do we want to pause for questions and see if there are particular topics that would be good to discuss in more depth?
Well, thanks for letting us take an active role in your presentation. I'd open that up to the rest of the group. if there are any things that you want Drew to go over in more depth that you've already heard, or if there's a direction that you would like him to take through the rest of this.
And I do have some go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just opening it up to anyone.
Okay, yeah, and for everyone else on the call, I did have a few other things that I could just show to help round this out. They may end up spawning whole conversations in themselves, but so I tried to take a lead from what Sean had mentioned in his email. And so, hopefully we've covered a little bit of an overview, somewhat of kind of what we're doing in ScienceBase on this data front, and then kind of how that looks with our pages and some of what we're doing. So getting into some of the details there, we also, I could show a few other documents that might be interesting. So we're kind of bounded to a certain extent by some of the guidelines that come out of the Bureau. So we don't have to get all the way into the details of this, but specifically authors, they're not required to use ScienceBase, and we're not the only system from which someone may host their content. But what we're looking at kind of on our end, what I'm working on with the team I lead, is sort of saying, okay, what do the current policies say about what needs to happen and how these pieces should connect, or what are the requirements for authors? And then what we've really built out over the last year is a process for, so I'm switching over, this is a formal document kind of at the Bureau level for policy. What we're looking at here is a document that sort of outlines the workflow that we've adopted and that we try to help authors walk through for using ScienceBase specifically to meet these open data requirements. And so what that looks like is basically a process by which we try to let authors know what the policy says. We try to walk them through the process of completing a set of steps in ScienceBase to meet the requirements of the policy, but then also upload and manage content and kind of go through things properly in our system. So we could talk a little bit more about that, but it ends up being that kind of specifically for the topic of this meeting with records management, we end up sort of intersecting with that at a particular level. So we've got a internal tracking and QC process in ScienceBase, and so that's been something that we've been refining and kind of improving over the last year and a half or so, just with the logistics. How do users log into the system? What are the file size limitations? How does metadata need to be structured, or tagging, that sort of thing. We handle the metadata records in that authors are responsible for creating these. The records do have to go through a review that's sort of separate from our system. That takes place as part of the USGS internal review process. But then we do store the metadata record, make it available for download with the data, and then also scrape information off that where we can to meet a couple goals. One, ease the burden of generating an entry in our system, and two, to try to ensure that critical pieces of information such as author or DOI that may be moving through several systems have a transfer mechanism. So we use it a little bit for that. And then this being kind of, I think at the end of the day, within both ScienceBase and the USGS, but then the scientific data community at large, it's how do we make it easier to get the actual data resources that underlie scientific findings or that support the conclusions that we are reading about in a manuscript. And so as a system, I think we have a large role, and a lot of the particular steps that we have implemented are in place with the goal of supporting this as the, really what we're trying to do at the end of the day. The way we intersect with that is that we're trying to work within the bounds of policy, help shape conversations around that, and figure out best practices and conventions, even as some of this still continues to evolve, I think in the USGS and generally, like the best way to do DOI issuance, that type of thing. So we kind of are one player in this, but then trying to keep some sense of the comprehensive goals of these various systems and how we fit into them. So in that realm, and maybe some other discussion points or conversations or conversation ideas could be looking at some of this. So how we partner with authors when they have one DOI or if they have multiple DOIs, challenges in that, and what works or what may still need improvement. Work IDs, so integrating with unique identifiers for authors to help streamline and make citation really robust, or tracking with research, et cetera. And then I think one of the big challenges, I don't know if this is unique to the USGS, I would imagine not, but it's definitely a component of what we're working through, is that we, in the case of ScienceBase, are one system kind of fitting into this whole bureau level ecosystem or landscape where certain components, so maybe the manuscripts are managed in a separate system, some other center websites or even research area or discipline area specific websites host other resources. So we're trying to navigate some of this, figure out best practices, but also we're kind of one component in a larger network of pieces that all are at play here. So yeah, if any of those would be good to cover in more depth, I'm happy to pause and take questions or try to go back and revisit if folks would like.
Well, Drew, I was pretty interested in what you're doing with unique identifiers. It's really great to see, DOIs getting pulled in, but also, forward thinking to identifiers for authors. Now, you said that there's a DOI for the landing page, for the publication, and then for a data package or each particular file?
So right now, the way that we do this is that in every case, a formal USGS data release will always have at least one top-level identifier. So that would be the digital object identifier, and that's always issued at the data release bundle level. So the language of the policy around this kind of treats data releases as a publication type. So one has a data release, it's a kind of discrete unit, and within that you may have a single table or you could have hundreds of files, right? In a lot of cases that's often what we see. So the way that the kind of the prescribed citation practice currently, and I mention this because I think some of this is somewhat plastic or evolving, but we're sort of working with a prescribed citation format that is structured around this construct of one DOI at the top level of that data publication. So this would be, data release 1, 2, 3, Smith and Jones 2016, it's got a DOI, and then has kind of a formal citation. That prescribed citation protocol is kind of sometimes may work just fine, but in other cases may start to break down where or when authors have kind of a couple different goals potentially or needs. So one might be where the individual data files kind of within that data publication unit, there may be a desire to access them at a granular level, so either through machine access, resolvable DOI that could give you access to specific files, or even just with citation practice, that if it were important enough to cite specific resources individually as members of a set, sometimes authors are interested in doing that. You could understand probably cases where that would be important. And so what we've got right now in the USGS, I think this is an opportunity for improvement, but we will always have one top-level DOI for the data release. Within that, if authors choose to obtain other more granular identifiers, they can issue other DOIs as needed for files within that set. The catch right now, I think one of the challenges we have is what does that then mean for citation? Because the DOIs are actually, they sort of play a couple different roles. They're involved in access to content. So you could imagine a DOI being used in a metadata record as the direct channel back to a file. but then they're also used or could be used in the citation. So we're trying to sort of align access needs and the integration with the way like a whole research project might be structured and downstream tools may connect to it. How do we collectively consider all of those needs alongside what the USGS is sort of handing us in terms of the protocol for citing data releases? And that's evolving. So it's a long way of saying that there's some discrepancy in how this is being done. But some authors will get that top-level data release digital object identifier and also obtain digital object identifiers for the files within it. In other cases, authors just get one digital object identifier for the whole set and leave it at that, even if there are multiple files within the data publication.
So it's fairly open-ended for the author to decide the importance of the components of the data package?
Yeah, it's up to the author, and this is an evolving dialogue where I have some thoughts on this that are kind of in my own, just in the realm of my personal approach to what I think might make sense. I'll kind of go off script here and say that, so I think some of this is still being talked through in the Bureau. The challenges and the needs are still kind of, people are collectively getting their heads around that. And then we're looking at, okay, what options do we have for granular DOI issuance, et cetera. So I think actually a good model would be to have a top-level digital object identifier for a data publication, and then to have digital object identifiers or maybe unique IDs, something like granular identifiers underneath that could identify more discrete files within that collection, but that also conveyed to someone who might be looking at it that a particular file is a member of a set. So we'd have one top-level DOI and then identifiers underneath that as needed to support granular access or granular reference without confusing the top-level citation from any citation or reference to resources within that. So I've been trying to kind of talk through that in the USGS with what that might look like, et cetera, and as well as trying to help people understand that we've got DOIs sort of filling different needs in different contexts. We're using them in some cases for access to the data. In other cases, we're using it for citing the data. In other cases, we might be wanting to use it in some sort of tracking or record mechanism. So how many products or publications have come out of some center or are associated with some author, and or looking at downstream tracking of use, et cetera. And so I think when we look at all of those goals, the approach we want to take would do best to try to think about how could we account for all of those and have a convention in place that would allow us to do those things without conflating them or mixing them up. So you might, a simple example might be, well, if I issue one DOI for a publication and we're tracking productivity, well then that author is associated with one product. If someone obtains 2,000 DOIs that aren't distinguishable from one another in terms of members of a set or a top-level DOI, if we were trying to use DOIs to do something like track productivity or total scientific output or products released, another author might have what looks like 2,000, resources, and that's a bit of an extreme example, but you can just think through how, if that's a goal or something we think we might want to utilize the DOI to track or to, to measure, accounting for these types of nuances becomes pretty important.
Yeah, definitely. So one other question, and then I'll let you get back to it. It's clear that citation and getting people to cite the things that they're using is important here. And it looked like there was a specific citation that was listed on that landing page for the data set.
There, it's all brand. Yeah, this one here.
How did you decide what citation format to use? I've recently been, writing a paper that I hope to publish, and using a citation tool, Zotero, and it gives me like 20 different 20 different citation methods, you know, that I could use for different ways of putting that citation out for APA or, you know, various other citation types. How did you decide on this format?
So that's where we are actually kind of handed that. Currently, that's sort of been dictated by the USGS for us. So we have some folks, and this is evolving. I think it's good guidance so far, but some of the nuances of what we're talking about, I think, aren't yet really determined in terms of how those are accounted for in this. But I think this citation, and again, this is sort of my unofficial answer, but as I understand it, it's kind of modeling the citation that the Bureau has used for text publications and other resources in the past. So this has been something that's kind of handed to us in ScienceBase, or actually in the policy, where it says, okay, here's how one would cite a data release. And then we're mirroring that and trying to help authors get this set up and just display it on the page. But yeah, it's a great question in terms of you know, how we come up with this or what this means. But right now we're just trying to adhere to what they've prescribed.
Okay.
And then maybe, I guess I'll sort of switch gears here for a minute. I mean, this is just sort of an ongoing dialogue in this, and again, kind of unofficially here, but just to sort of look at the actual process as it's happening, is that the best convention in this is I think, still a topic of conversation, and what I was trying to describe earlier would be something like this, where an approach could be to have a top-level identifier for kind of the publication as such, granular identifiers that would be resolvable that might support citation, or at the very least, file access and reference underneath that, but where a human or a machine could sort of recognize that this was a component of this one unambiguous citation. The challenge now that we have is that authors can get multiple identifiers for files within one data release, but they don't have this shared uniform structure that would indicate to someone that these were all members of a set. It's not the end of the world, but I think it's an opportunity for improvement and kind of something that we're still working on. So I know some other folks have been looking at this. This is a picture of I think Lalit Wanchu. I saw a presentation he did at ESIP actually a few years ago, and just this morning actually there was something that was shared kind of across the I'm on a couple email sharing threads, but basically this was an article that came out, had some reference actually back to the ESIP group and some members about existing challenges and this exact topic, best practice for granular issuance and convention, and kind of the outstanding need we have for some shared approaches on that. And then if anyone's curious too, just another little thought on that is I think in sharing some materials and this ongoing dialogue, we've sort of talked about what does this mean to have individual citations, or what are the approaches, and I think there's a couple different ways to do this. I think at the end of the day, we really want to support the ability for people to say, I used this resource, and this is exactly the file I used, and to support reproducible findings and kind of unambiguously pointed back to what was done or what was used. So to that end, I think we don't have to always have individual DOIs, but they can help. So in this case, you can see here these numbers change. So this would show how granular files can be independently cited. This would be one way to do that if granular DOIs are obtained. Right now, this doesn't really mesh with the prescribed citation, though, that we've been given, I think, from the document, so that's just kind of evolving. The other option is that you might not have individual DOIs. You've just got one top level, and I think some folks might say, oh, the horror, how are we going to know what was used? And I would point out that we can use, other conventions, such as referring to things with, with language in a way to say, here's one top level DOI that's recycled, but then granular files can in fact be referenced if that's needed. So I think that's another option to keep in mind, with just being able to cite back to what was used, but keeping like all of these goals in mind: citation goals, machine access goals, tracking and reporting goals, and maybe even looking at the implications of the way systems are structured, like if we wanted to be able to query and say very readily, how many resources has this individual put out? Some of the APIs that are out there with, with easy ID, et cetera, could lend themselves to answering those questions, but they do have some assumptions about the conventions that have been adopted. Have I gone totally off topic, Sean, or is this somewhat related to what you were maybe hoping we could cover? Is there?
Yeah, no, you're definitely on topic. We've only got about 15 minutes left, so I don't want to pull you away from your conclusion if there was something that you wanted to wrap up. I've got some more nuts and bolts questions, but we can put that at the end.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really it. I mean, I guess.
Okay.
Was there a question there? I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, I guess the summary here is that this is somewhat still evolving. There's a lot of moving parts, and in our case as well, we're trying to just integrate with language of the policy documents. In some cases, it's been working with the groups who have been authoring those documents to try to say, hey, maybe we could update the language to account for A, B, or C, or make sure that authors have some a clear path for their cases. And what we've seen over the last 2 years has been, a lot of different cases of these kind of, well, what about in this scenario, or we're trying to do this, or the way my data have to be structured need to look like this such that they can be accessed by a downstream tool, that sort of thing. So all of these pieces kind of together, trying to elegantly handle them the best we can, and then kind of particularly from the science-based side, we end up interacting with authors firsthand. So there's often some confusion or hand-holding, or just trying to figure out, well, what makes the most sense, in your case. So I think at the end of the day that the big picture goal is really trying to create a landscape or the fabric that supports robust science. So if we're doing, this not that long ago, the way we would get back to data would be we'd read a scholarly journal article or hear about something, and at that point you're left trying to follow up with an author to maybe get the data they generated, and it's an email and type of approach. So we're trying to move from that to say, how do we actually say, if we're describing findings and results that are a resource in and of themselves, kind of a resource in their own right, how do we connect that and expose that content out to support citation and valuable downstream use, reuse of that data. And so while some of these details are on the exact process of how we integrate all these systems, the components or the informational pieces or records, in some cases if they're XML files, but which parts need to be transferred across systems, and how does all this stuff work together? I would say the outstanding questions are still, what's the, how do all these pieces tie back together for a comprehensive reporting and tracking approach? I think we're making some steps on that, but it's evolving. The other thing is looking at how do we set ourselves up where maybe some of this could be automatic, specifically looking at some sort of automatic tie-in to understanding where resources are used downstream. And I think digital object identifiers and ORCIDs and like ResearchGate, some of this has already kind of been figured out or is working. So we have some models, but looking at supporting that, where could we come back and on a page like this, connect to other systems and then systematically update downstream products that have cited this as an input. So evolving, I think we've got some models we could look at, but not fully in place yet, but I think we'd like to be able to take that there and see if ScienceBase could help on that front. And I think that would help meet bureau needs, but just from the scientific community standpoint, like knowing, connecting what's been used where and which inputs were used to support other findings is a very powerful piece of this. So lest I get too in the weeds or philosophical about this, I just think that we do have some challenges on the individual pieces still, but I'm trying to take a big picture look at the end goals that we're trying to support, allowing some flexibility within the bounds of the guidance we're working within along the way, but trying to improve our process wherever we can to support those big picture goals.
Yeah, and I think that there, are a lot of groups out there who are working with similar issues. NCAR would definitely come to mind. One of their pushes on uniting all of their labs is to make their data and themselves more visible through empowering the people who are using their data to create good citations. So this is a really good thing for some of them to look at. Now, I was curious, you had mentioned that you will take an XML file from the author. Does that author have access to tools that help them create that in other parts of USGS?
Yes. So the general workflow in most cases is that an author finalizes data content and metadata, and that process, and I think in most places actually is best managed kind of on your local network or working with your colleagues at whatever sort of shared network locations you've got, and then you can kind of upload that into ScienceBase or wherever you want to host it kind of at the end of the process. So in practice, that looks like some review and then actually data finalization that's happening kind of locally, so to speak. An author would be generating a metadata record, and we've got a couple tools for authors to do that. I've worked on one that plugs into ArcGIS, so if folks are working with geospatial data, there's a tool that actually I think gives people a nice running start for pulling out some of the kind of intrinsic information, so extent, feature counts, or row and column counts, and then we'll do like a tabular traverse where we'll pull out column values automatically, that sort of thing. So that's the USGS metadata wizard that works with CSDGM metadata. There's another tool in the Bureau, the online metadata editor. That's basically just a web-based application, allows someone to create an FGDC metadata record. And then there are other workflows too. So if folks are comfortable working with XML directly and have their own processes in place, or what we often see too is like, some process wherein an author's reusing metadata content. So they're looking at scripting, let's say Python or R, to kind of generate a batch of metadata files. Generally that happens outside of ScienceBase and they kind of come to us afterwards, but I'm often helping authors with navigating like the best approach there to try to make it as painless as possible, or reducing the burden, but then getting the pieces we need in to the records. And another little note there is that there's an interesting component here too with the sequence of things, and I'm not sure if there are folks on the call who've intersected with this, but kind of this, so specifically through the process of getting one's data finalized and reviewed, one has to obtain kind of a DOI, so know where it will ultimately be, and provide like that location as part of their data review process. So in some cases, the data aren't actually posted online, but they have to have that DOI. So there's just a little bit of balancing that, so they have that piece as part of finalizing their data before, in some cases, before the data are actually up. And then we also have a process where we actually want to have that final DOI kind of injected back into metadata records as appropriate as well. And so we have a few, some cases it's just sort of manual where we work with authors and there's a one revision process to do that. We also have sort of some automated steps to do that too, where you can kind of update the metadata record to put that DOI back into it after it's actually issued. So we won't go too far into that unless people are curious, but yeah, just trying to balance those to make sure we have the informational pieces in the right places as they actually come into the picture.
Okay, but if I came to you as an author and I wanted to upload, you know, like a different dialect, say I had written my metadata in diff or ISO, ScienceBase isn't going to be able to use those XML documents to create the landing page. Is that right? Or are there multiple dialects that ScienceBase can handle?
Yeah, we support two dialects primarily now, the ISO dialect and then CSDGM. And specifically, those are metadata formats for which we've developed mappings out of the element values in those files into the core ScienceBase item model. So we don't support other mappings right now, so a user wouldn't get the benefit of having that kind of auto-populate from a record, but they could still just attach the metadata record and it would be parked on the item page in the same way that we see this one here. So it would just...
So the link on the left side for downloading the metadata, that would be the original record that the author submitted, not something that ScienceBase is generating?
That's correct, and that's kind of an important point here because we can actually generate item metadata. So we have a core item model that has, you know, in some cases metadata, so to speak, about it. But for these data release items in general, just kind of maintaining that distinction between this is the author-generated original documentation for a resource, we'll host it unmodified, and then in other cases we'll try to use it to streamline a process, or we might at a system level have some metadata, so to speak, about this resource in our system. But yeah, there is that distinction between author-provided original metadata and then, you know, maybe something in our system itself.
Great. Okay, well, I've dominated the question asking portion of today. We've got a couple of minutes left. If anybody else has a question for Drew about ScienceBase, now would be a good time. You're also, of course, welcome to contact him offline. All right, well, Drew, I'd like to thank you for sharing your time and your work with us today. You know, hopefully in the future, we will have some more interactions with you and the documentation cluster. Bruce has put a link in the chat to remind you about the Prov challenge at ESIP. So
I also wanted to say you guys did a session submission for the summer meeting too, so thanks for that.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. Probably some of my colleagues, maybe Tamar or Madison. But yeah, I know some of the folks in the group here. This is actually kind of the first time I've been involved with this ESIP cluster, so I'm kind of new to it. But yeah, I know that they've worked with you guys on some other stuff. So yeah, I appreciate the chance to chat with you guys, Sean. Hopefully it was somewhat useful, but that's just kind of a current snapshot of some of what we've been working on. I think some of what's already working pretty well, and then some of those areas where we're still trying to improve our process or tackle some of these looming challenges. But if anyone's curious and would like to follow up with me on anything from the talk today, feel free to email me or get in touch. But yeah, thanks again for the chance to talk.
Yep. And if anybody is looking for his email, it is CC'd on the Thursday announcement about today's meeting. You know, I think that you've got some really exciting challenges to tackle in the coming months and years. So thanks for sharing them with us. I think you know, a lot of other people will have some similar problems, and maybe they'll reach out and ask you how you've succeeded. So thank you, Drew.
All right, thank you, Sean. Thanks for everyone for calling in.
everyone.
All right, bye-bye, everyone.